So what do I think happened? There are a lot of things to point to who actually might have murdered Teresa Halbach, but my point here was to find out evidence that Stephen Avery is beyond a reasonable doubt guilty, not to find out who really did it. There are a lot of things popping up out there, and a lot of it character-driven and circumstantial, that it could be things like Scott Tadich and or Bobby Dassey, since they were each other's alibis. They lived on the property that had the burn barrel with her items in it. Tadich supposedly had issues with women and violence, which again is like what people say against Stephen Avery, but it goes to character, so it's circumstantial. But they also both testified against their own family, i.e. Bobby Dassey testified against his own brother, and Scott Tadich, who testified against his own now stepson, which is odd. Tadich apparently tried to sell a co-worker a .22 rifle shortly after the incident. Upon hearing the verdict, Scott Tadich, brother-in-law to Stephen Avery and now stepfather to Brendan Dassey, even though having Stephen Avery guilty pretty much means that his now stepson is basically going to be in prison for the rest of his life, said at the Stephen Avery verdict, quote, "What happened yesterday is the best thing in the world. He got what he got coming to him." Not, "I'm sorry for the family, I'm sorry for Teresa's family, I'm glad there was closure," but instead he scathes his own family like that. Very weird. Then there's the German, whose wife saw him acting erratically, like somebody going through the full tilt boogie, and had a hammer with blood on it and bones in the yard. Hell, I watched a video of a guy who says he used to live in the area talking about some weird sex club that the elites of the community have, where a friend of his died under strange circumstances and the whole group may be involved. He also says that this weird sex club controls all the good jobs in the area all the way up to Green Bay, as this big, huge conspiracy club, kind of like what you see in the movie Eyes Wide Shut. There's lots of weird stories out there and scenarios with different people. Could it be that the Avery land is coveted for monetary or political gain? There's a theory out there that the land is what the government or the county was really after. Would that have been the reason to not let them put the land up for his bail? If Stephen Avery were to jump bail and the land was collateral, what would happen? Would the land then go to the bail bondsman? A bondsman would generally be somebody with no criminal background that the county couldn't pin anything on. Given that obstacle, would the land then be harder for them to acquire? If the bonds came from, say, some out-of-state agency that really supplied the money, the county would have no way of fixing anything to get at them. Would that have affected it? Again, all in theory. Could it be the ex who conveniently didn't know what time he got to Teresa Halbach's house or what he was dropping off to her roommate the last day he saw her alive? Someone posted a picture of Teresa Halbach's ex with scratches on his left hand that no one said anything about. Could her roommate be involved, with or without her ex? Why did her ex have no idea what time he came over the other day before she disappeared? Why were the ex and the roommate not asked to provide an alibi? Why were they given special permission to cross police lines when things were roped off that nobody else was granted? Who erased those voicemails that those two, and only those two, had access to by breaking into her voicemail, on a whim no less? Not to mention that I read that those two breaking into her voicemail is actually a crime in itself, and only law enforcement officers can legally do that. Sure, Stephen Avery used Star 67, but they were the ones with access to her account, and the provider said that it clearly looked like the voicemail isn't full, and her brother told everyone that her phone went straight to voicemail since it was full. In fact, that was one of the things that prompted her mother to call her in as a missing person. That's another thing that irks me, personally. Her brother seemed to be smiling an awful lot during this whole thing, as did quite a few of the prosecution's witnesses on the stand. Teresa Halbach's brother talked about her in the past tense very early on before she was even considered dead, and then he corrected himself. That and he too seemed blind to what was in front of him, and to me he seemed too eager to place blame on Stephen Avery when there was nothing at the time to connect him. I'm sure some conspiracy theorists will say that since he now works for the Packers, he's the reason for their poor season. I'm joking. Which leads to another conspiracy theory that she's actually alive and well, and of course probably hanging out with Elvis and JFK at a Stuckey somewhere. But some would theorize that she's probably somewhere on a tropical island as a bartender or a travel specialist. But if the family takes vacations to the same spot every year, that might be something to look out for. I did see that once on a show. Has anyone ever looked into that? Because that certainly would be a case breaker, finding her alive in Aruba somewhere. As fate would have it, Gregory Allen was not surveilled at the exact day and time he committed the assault on Penny Bernstein, which led to the 18 years of Stephen Avery being wrongfully imprisoned. And I'm guessing that Manitowoc County, population of about 70,000, doesn't have a very high murder rate. Now, granted, I wrote this before Jodi's interview a couple days ago, but the fact that Teresa Halbach could have disappeared and got killed in the exact same time frame as these depositions were occurring is, believe it or not, plausible from the timeline, actions, and what the evidence would tell me. But after Jodi's interview, I'm not necessarily so sure. Then again, the bullet size from the bones of the skull would be a major deciding factor in whether or not I would choose to say that one of the deposed cops did this, although it's not a stretch to think that by any means, considering what she said. If Avery had any complaints against him from the magazine and the cops knew about that through the grapevine, that too could have thrown this into action, since I'm sure they would have been looking for something to pin on him, since these depositions were about to bring holy hell and they only had 2 to 4 weeks to do something about it before those depositions were concluded. Did anyone ever ask the cops if they were aware of the Teresa Halbach complaints against Stephen Avery? I'm going to interject here in case you haven't caught on. I wrote this thing before the interview with Stephen Avery's fiancée or ex-fiancée Jodi that came out a couple of days ago. I'm going to try to keep it pretty much the way I had it instead of rewriting this whole analysis because I really need to get this thing published. But I now think that with that little tidbit of evidence she gave about the police not letting her out of jail to attend a meeting that exact day for unknown reasons, now almost irreversibly shifts my theory to the cops instead of away from them. Amazing what a little piece of evidence can do. So I'm going to read this as I wrote it originally, but understand that nobody knows what happened just yet. But this previously written theory certainly stands as is, but also know this could just as easily implicate the police as it would my original theory, since it always was a possibility. So regardless of what's said, you can imply both. However, I will say one thing. Whoever murdered Teresa Halbach, what happens after the fact is what I'm concerning myself with, because from there, I at least have enough evidence in my mind to form a plausible theory as to what happened and the police being adversely involved from that point. This is assuming the police didn't do it, but they did something after the fact. The only real piece of evidence, aside from the new piece Jodi gave us, because that's technically not evidence, that points to the cops is when Lieutenant James Lank signs the release for Stephen Avery's blood to get tested, since it was years before the Teresa Halbach disappearance, would prove premeditation years before the fact, or at least having some safeguard. Again, only if the blood is someday proven that it had EDTA in it, and or it could be proven that it came from the same vial. That would imply that if he actually stole the blood, yet signed out for it with his own name 3 years before this happened and before Stephen Avery was exonerated, then that would be hella premeditation as an absolute just in case. Having that kind of foresight, though, would contradict the amateurish planting of the evidence that he did, so that's another reason I'd be leaning towards the timing. Well, was leaning. I'd say more than likely someone managed to get that out of storage secretly right before the planting of this evidence, since I'm pretty sure quite a few people in that building had access to that room and the blood that was stored in it. That makes more sense timeline-wise. But then again, so after the fact, it happened. Teresa Halbach is murdered, and Colburn, out of happenstance, being told about it or knowing the real situation from the person that did it, or even doing it himself. Again, just because the cops might not have killed her doesn't mean they couldn't either help the person who did it or help the person who did it get away in exchange for the opportunity to frame Stephen Avery. Colburn finds her car, and she's already dead, and he calls in the plates on November 3rd to check. They take it to the property, Stephen Avery's property. Now, a possible theory that I don't really take into consideration is that they tow the car like amateurs with a tow strap and break the blinker. Just to mention it, but I don't really like it. Again, I think they drive it there since they obviously have the key. Did they gather any of the deposed law enforcement officers' DNA for the comparison on any of that evidence? Doubt it, so one of those law enforcement officers' DNA could still be on the RAV4 to this day. Either way, someone drove it, parked it, and hid it, or attempted to hide it, in a very conspicuously inconspicuous way. But how did it get there, and what happened to that blinker? They never discussed that. I noticed that in the documentary, that the blinker was in the back of the cargo bay of the RAV4 and the headlight looked cracked. Theories on that. Someone could have been the passenger in her car and run her off the road, then kidnapped and or killed her. While doing so, the left front of the RAV hit something and damaged it. This might explain the scratches on the ex's hand, but, and assuming this was done by somebody she didn't know, the other more plausible theory I have is that someone forces an accident to get her out of the car so they can kidnap and murder her, and they put the blinker in the back as to not give a clue to where the accident took place. This theory either needs more than one perpetrator or a perpetrator that somehow subdues Teresa Halbach, moves his car to some inconspicuous location to park it, and takes her car to wherever to kill her all by himself. This doesn't really add up because it would have to take place in a location that the perp's car could be inconspicuously moved a short distance from where the accident/kidnapping took place and then parked, then have the perp jump into her car and continue the crime, and she would have had to do this in a remote area where no one would see this go down in broad daylight on Halloween when people are driving around to hunt, trick or treat, and come home from work. Highly unlikely. The other part to that being, why would she have been in a remote area, unless of course the whole damn county is remote? Again, this is assuming that she is killed by a stranger. Also, were there ever pictures taken of any police vehicles that sustained damage in this time period? I think this could be another major breaking point in this case, because that would kind of point to a suspect, wouldn't it? Police departments, mainly larger population area police departments, usually have a county or a city worker do the repairs on the government vehicles, or if they're a smaller community, they farm all the work out to a local garage. However, and this may also be the key along with Jodi's statement in order to further this investigation on the police. Most county or city shops that service their own county, city, police, fire, dump truck, plow truck, etc. vehicles only do maintenance repairs. I know, I worked in that industry. I sold parts and services to these very people. But if there is auto body work to be done, since it's on an as-needed basis and involves insurance, unlike oil changes, brakes, and other guaranteed, needed, and scheduled repairs, auto body is therefore almost always farmed out. Most of the time, if the municipality purchases new, it's almost like a lease. They'll take it to that dealership that they purchased it from to do that type of work, because most dealerships either have a shop themselves or an affiliation with the shop they farm the work out to. This, I think, will be the key to cracking this case, because there will be a record of an officer hitting something. I'm not sure that whatever they said they hit will be correct, but nonetheless, they will hit something to which the affected area will have to be documented, usually with a digital camera, for an estimation, which will have a record of what was damaged and hence what needed to be repaired, which will be in the record databanks of a private shop and not a police shop. A police shop where they can easily dispose of evidence or stymie an investigation. And this, I guarantee you, would have taken place because there's three things you will never see a cop car being: dirty, broken, or dented. So if a police car was brought in and there was some damage to it, the body shop that was repairing it would take pictures to prove to the insurance company and the police of what they needed to do in order to fix it, which means they would have evidence, perhaps something like greenish blue paint that could easily be forensically identified as the paint coming off of a 1999 Toyota RAV4. Granted, the paint evidence I'm sure is long gone, but the picture evidence might still be around. Then, if the RAV4 is still in evidence, they can use that as warrant material to see if any transfer happened from a police vehicle whose paint could be forensically identified to that of police cars to Teresa Halbach's RAV4. This tying in the cop's car to her vehicle and rolling this ball downhill. This is what is going to do them in. Back to the original analysis. So since the vehicle is in place and the police somehow know it, the police involved used a one-day span to acquire, if they've not already done so, Stephen Avery's blood and plant his blood in the RAV4. Because you can't plant fingerprints, but you can plant blood and rub sweat with his clothes that they have access to, even in jail. So they plant the blood, even though the undersheriff said that that's impossible for them to acquire, which turns out to be patently false. So again, is it stupidity, naivete, or is he hiding something? They have Sturm look for the RAV4 now on the 5th on the Avery property, since the vehicle is now there to find, and she finds it due to divine intervention, and now the cops go into action. This too is key because, as I stated earlier, she and her daughter get there late that morning, and yet instead of the early searchers getting the cool tools, the latecomers, when no one else in the entire party is around to see or hear any of these discussions, mind you, they're given a map, camera, and a direct line to Sheriff Poggle. So Pam Sturm is either one of God's chosen, an innocent pawn in this whole thing, or she is in on this, to which that would mean that she has knowledge of the murder of Teresa Halbach, who is a distant relative of hers, to which, if that's the case, brings the possibility of the exes and roommates and brothers' strange behavior into this conspiracy, which even further lends credibility to the guy who says the elites of the town are involved in some sex club ring, which is furthered when Detective Wiegert from the Calumet County, a completely separate county and department, calls Detective Remaker of Manitowoc County mere hours before the vehicle is discovered and says, "The boss has a change of plans." Staying along this train of thought for a second, if the Halbachs were dairy farmers and Teresa Halbach was an independent contractor photographer with 2 jobs, i.e. not currently on or even heading down the road to high society, and this supposed sex club ring controls all the good jobs and it went all the way into Green Bay, it would fit the theory of this crazy sex ring because Teresa Halbach's brother Mike is the spokesperson for the Halbach family during this whole event, who was talking about his sister in the past tense before the car was discovered and smiling oddly and colluding with his sister's ex and going full force for Stephen Avery's guilt, is now in the upper echelon of the Green Bay Packers organization as the director of football technology at the age of 32. He probably got that position a little earlier, so kind of a good job for the son of a dairy farmer, wouldn't you think? Not to mention that the Green Bay Packers are the only NFL team that don't have an owner. They're owned by the community. Ooh, the good jobs. They control all the good jobs. Pretty juicy tidbit for all you conspiracy theorists out there. Yummy. Do I buy into that theory? Not really, but Eyes Wide Shut and Bohemian Grove get their storylines from somewhere. Anyway, as for the call about the boss's change of plans, was this innocently referring to bringing everyone now on the property to search it like the call said because they were narrowing in on the fact that Teresa Halbach was last seen on the Avery property? Was it bringing bones on the property and dabbing Stephen Avery's blood and sweat on the RAV4 to tie him into it instead of just having the vehicle on his property? Was the car on the property without any of their knowledge, but they wanted to further bury the needle by doing that other stuff? Don't know for sure, as this is a theory, but either way, needs to be said. So, they now have the Avery land to themselves for 8 days with the Averys miles away in their cabin up north there. If they somehow don't have the body, they wait until it's found, but either way, someone burns the body in another location, or if it's already burned, then simply moves the body to scatter the ashes on the Avery location. Even though the RAV4 has his blood in it, the cops still look like possible players because they have no physical corroborating evidence that Avery actually did it. But they have enough for the media hype and they arrest him in order to desperately try to get him to settle his suit to pay the lawyers, thus letting them off the $36 million hook. $36 million. That's 6 Lee Majors. Anyway, he has to settle his lawsuit to pay for the attorneys so they can breathe a sigh of relief, but it's only a small breath because now they have to put him away for good on this because this other lawsuit for this case is possibly waiting to happen and the people involved start to smell that, especially since there's nothing that really connects Stephen Avery to the crime, so they have to do something. The people aren't buying it, even after 4 months, so the cops press Jodi, who tells them to flunk off. So they press Avery's alibi, Brendan Dassey, who instead of merely scrapping Avery's alibi, Dassey instead gives them gold. It completes the trifecta of MMO, even though there is not one piece of evidence that rock solidly corroborates any of it. You have A, B, C, E, and F, and LMN, PQ, but there are major missing pieces in between. There are 3 that are close, the bullet, the key, and the blood minus EDTA, but nothing past reasonable doubt that would rise to the level of without a doubt. Not to mention that all those pieces of actual incriminating evidence are the ones the police planted. So there's not even a single piece that they can at least turn to and say, well, there's this one. Nothing in Brendan Dassey's testimony helps them out, but it's so sensational that the hype helps to carry the day and win their case. Not only did they destroy Avery's story and alibi, and even though, when asked to tell the truth, Brendan Dassey writes down an uneventful evening where he played video games and went to his uncle's bonfire, but now they have a story that they can sensationalize that the media can run with, to which they do, and any jury who gets chosen will have the thought of guilt already in their minds that Stephen Avery is a cold-blooded, kidnapping, rapist, mutilating murderer. And it obviously works, according to the excused juror, not to mention the verdict. None of which there is evidence for, or to which there is at least counter-evidence that it actually didn't happen. They tie him to the RAV4 when they plant the key. With Dassey's new coerced testimony about Stephen Avery shooting her in the head, they take either a bullet that they have, or they take his gun and fire the bullet, since they only have one piece of forensic evidence besides the muscle tissue, was the bullet holes in her head, even though I've yet to find out what caliber it was that equated to the size of the holes in the head. Was it 22, or was it another caliber, like a 9mm that a cop would use perhaps? Then they take the bullet, swab her DNA on it, but they can't do very much with what little they have left, supposedly from maybe the tibia, so they have to contaminate the sample with the tester tech's DNA in order to make it even remotely legit. They figure that even though it's supposed to be listed as inconclusive, they try to enter it as evidence, as an honest mistake, and it works. If there was ever a case to show how important the media is in forming public opinion, this is it. If it wasn't for this fact that this is the only time in her career that this ever happened, that and my background in genetics, knowing that this is the only possible scenario, given the fact that she had only this viable sample left, didn't replicate it, used the sample up, and it came back contaminated with no way to redo the test, if it weren't for this being blatantly tampered with, I would probably be on the fence about Stephen Avery being not guilty. Ergo, I wouldn't have used hours and hours of my life making this. She has the most important sample of her life in her hands, and she has one shot to do it, yet blabs through it. Good thing she's not a trapeze artist. But anyway, let's recap from the beginning what happened, shall we? Since they had the key to the RAV4 and Colburn called in the plate, which he said there was only one license plate, but the defense seemed to have them both, which is why I think they were the ones who moved the vehicle, they scrubbed the key to put Stephen Avery's DNA via sweat on it, plant the key, again the two key people, no pun intended, Link and Colburn, who weren't supposed to be there on the site and their presence was proven to be falsified, and who later plant the bullet, which they magically find months later, even though, as stated before, that the 22 bullets, if they poke through the skull, splatter everywhere, and none of her DNA was found anywhere on all that junk in the garage, or they stay in the brain and deflect off the skull and smash the bullet, thus making it unidentifiable via ballistics testing, to which the bullets would have been found in the fire and not the garage. Not to mention the fire would have burned all tissue and DNA off of it, making the victim unidentifiable, and even though he was about to crash the lives of many law enforcement officers and government officials, a department, and a city for $36 million, instead they successfully feed the jury, the media, and the public the story of how, instead of waiting just a bit longer to collect his lottery winnings, after 2 years of being out and not causing any problems, after being wrongfully locked up for 18 years, Stephen Avery does the one thing that would guarantee his return to that hellhole cage that every human would hate. The prosecution says that due to pure murderous lust, she was kidnapped, raped, throat slit, choked, dragged out to the garage, shot, cut up, mutilated, and burned by Stephen Avery. Then, within a 5-day period, Stephen Avery somehow forgot and left sitting there the only 3 pieces of evidence at all in this case: the bullet, the key, and the car, which were all planted, untouched, uncrushed, unburned, and unthrown into Lake Michigan for the police to conveniently find. But yet, he burned the body past recognition, which is what cops hiding evidence would be able to do and know how to do. No, Stephen Avery did it. By the way, did anyone ever contact a coroner or any funeral homes to see if anyone would have asked them to use a crematorium in that time frame? If you're still convinced that Stephen Avery is without a doubt guilty, ladies, leave your phone number, because I have a penthouse in Malibu, Miami, New York, Paris, and St. Martin's that I could sell you dirt cheap. And guys, I've got this bridge in Brooklyn for sale, along with some great beachfront property in Arizona you'd absolutely love. If after reading this or listening to this, the whole thing, if you still think he's guilty, either prove it to me, which is kind of the whole point of why I did this, or don't breed. I hope you come away from this having the same understanding of the evidence that I do. If he's guilty, this does not prove it to me. In fact, everything proves otherwise. If you have any questions, I would love to hear them. If you can bring something up or an angle on this evidence that I didn't think of, or present me with some facts that weren't in the case or that weren't disclosed in the series or discussed here, please comment on them. And that's why I did this. I really want to prove that he's guilty if he's guilty. Now, if you're going to be stupid or reiterate a point that's already been made or argue a point that's legitimately discredited, I'm going to delete it. Simply because I wish to save room for a legitimate and intelligent debate and discussion and leave room for someone with the power and ability to see this and find some way to free Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey. That is the other reason I did this. To find out more about what really happened and to set them free if they indeed are innocent. I too, in a way, hope he's guilty, because the alternative is unthinkable. Please pass this along and realize that all of us, even in America, are only one wrong encounter of pissing off the wrong person with power, like that judge in Georgia, or one wrong move away from any of this ourselves. Again, if you're going to check out something for yourself to find out more about this, what I've said, new information that's brought up, please check out the missed corroboration that if the cops planted the key, the cops had the car, and the cops moved the car with her body and blood in it. The next would be if there's no exit wound from the skull or body, because if there was, there'd be spatter, or vice versa, there'd be no bullet or a smashed, unidentifiable bullet in the fire which would have destroyed the DNA, then the bullet was by definition planted. The next would be the connection between the genes and the consent to search by a minor, Brendan Dassey, that led to both the confiscation of the genes, ergo the line of suggestive questioning, lying, ergo incrimination for both Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey. That is the big one regarding the legalese, I believe. The next would be the fact that they didn't let Jodi out that fateful night with no explanation to this day. That is going to be huge, because that is going to start you down the road to find out who killed her, which is going to be the absolute way to exonerate Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey from this case. And last but not least, the one that's there would be the one that can absolutely prove beyond a doubt would be is if they can prove that EDTA is present in that blood. And if they can do that, this all goes away. Again, because it's in evidence, you need to convince a judge, and everything's been spent. All those have been used up. So, also, I would love to have an independent party and or lab analyze the muscle tissue on the tibia, assuming there's still some left. That will prove to me once and for all on an independent basis that this actually is Teresa Halbach and an actual crime was committed. Every county has a coroner, and every county has a morgue. Just another wrinkle in this massive sheet of the woven